In the rugged mountains of central Sardinia, there's a genetic anomaly that shouldn't exist. In 2018, researchers analyzing DNA samples from the island's most isolated villages made a discovery that defied everything we thought we knew about European history. They found people, living, breathing humans in the 21st century, whose genetic profiles were virtually identical to skeletons pulled from Bronze Age burial sites. Not similar, identical. These weren't distant relatives or vague connections. The DNA hadn't changed in 5,000 years. Across this small Mediterranean island, roughly the size of Vermont, millions of people carry a genetic signature that vanished from the rest of Europe millennia ago. They are walking fossils, a population that somehow avoided the migrations, invasions, and genetic revolutions that transformed every other corner of the continent. They are Europe's most extreme genetic isolate, and their existence rewrites the story of who Europeans are and where they came from. This is a story of how Sardinia became Europe's greatest genetic mystery, and why, after 7,000 years of isolation, that mystery is finally coming to an end. Islands are usually melting pots. Sicily, just 200 miles to the east, is a genetic chaos of Greek, Arab, Norman, and Spanish ancestry. Malta is a mix of Phoenician, Roman, and North African. Crete blends Minoan, Greek, and Turkish. Every Mediterranean island tells a story of mixture, of sailors and conquerors leaving their DNA behind. But Sardinia is different. Sardinia is a fortress. Despite being invaded repeatedly, despite centuries of foreign rule, despite being surrounded by some of the most active trade routes in human history, the Sardinian people remained genetically unchanged. Geneticists call this a genetic isolate, a population that somehow avoided the mixing that defines the rest of humanity. And Sardinia isn't just any isolate, it's the most extreme genetic isolate in all of Europe. In 2020, a landmark study published in Nature Genetics analyzed the DNA of over 3,000 Sardinians from across the island. What they found was unprecedented. Modern Sardinians derive between 56% and 62% of their ancestry directly from the first farmers who arrived on the island over 7,000 years ago. That's not a typo. More than half of their DNA comes from a single migration event that happened before writing, before cities, before anything we recognize as civilization. No other European population comes close. Basques, often considered Europe's most ancient people, average around 35% early European farmer ancestry. Cypriots reach about 40%. But Sardinians? They are the farmers. They are living, breathing descendants of the people who brought agriculture to Europe, preserved in genetic amber by the sea. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to 5,500 BC. The Neolithic Revolution, the transition from hunting and gathering to farming, was spreading across Europe like wildfire. It started in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, when people first domesticated wheat, barley, sheep, and goats. These early farmers didn't just spread their technology, they spread themselves. They sailed across the Mediterranean, island hopping from Greece to Italy, establishing farming communities on every piece of land they could reach. When they arrived in Sardinia around 5,500 BC, they found an island rich in resources, covered in oak forests, surrounded by fish-filled seas, and almost completely empty. There may have been a few Mesolithic hunter-gatherers already there, but if so, they left almost no genetic trace. The farmers settled, thrived, and multiplied. They brought the physical appearance we now associate with Mediterranean people. Dark hair, dark eyes, olive skin. They built villages, raised livestock, and farmed the valleys. And then something extraordinary happened. They stopped mixing. Across the rest of Europe, these early farmers eventually encountered other populations. In Northern Europe, they mixed with the original hunter-gatherers, the blue-eyed, dark-skinned people who had survived the Ice Age. Later, around 3000 BC, they were overwhelmed by a massive invasion from the east. The Yamnaya, steppe herders from the grasslands north of the Black Sea, swept across Europe bringing horses, wheels, bronze weapons, and a new language family, Indo-European. The Yamnaya carried a Y chromosome marker called R1b, and within just a few centuries, it became the dominant male lineage across Western Europe. In Britain, over 90% of the pre-existing male lineages were replaced. In Spain, the same. In Germany, the Netherlands, France, everywhere the Yamnaya went, they genetically transformed the population. But not Sardinia. Look at a map of R1b distribution in Europe. It's like a red blanket covering the continent, stretching from Ireland to Romania, from Norway to Portugal. And then there's Sardinia, a white hole in the middle of the Mediterranean. R1b in Sardinia averages just 15%, and most of that arrived much later with medieval settlers. The Bronze Age steppe invasion that defined European genetics simply didn't reach the island. Why? The obvious answer is geography. Sardinia is 120 miles from the Italian mainland, far enough that casual migration was rare. But Sicily is also an island, and it shows clear steppe ancestry. So is Crete, and it does too. Geography alone doesn't explain it. Some researchers point to malaria. Sardinia was plagued by malaria for thousands of years, making the coastal lowlands deadly to outsiders who lacked immunity. The swamps and wetlands that surrounded the island's ports were natural barriers that killed invaders before they could reproduce. Others suggest it was cultural resistance. The Sardinians who built the Nuragic civilization weren't primitive. They were fierce, organized, and deeply connected to their land. When outsiders came, they didn't welcome them. They fought them, isolated them, and refused to intermarry. Whatever the reason, the result is clear. While the rest of Europe became Indo-European, Sardinia remained Old European. They missed the genetic revolution that redefined the continent. They are the last survivors of Neolithic Europe, a population that everywhere else was swallowed up or pushed aside. Around 1600 BC, Sardinia entered one of the most fascinating periods in its history. The Nuragic civilization emerged, named after the Nuraghe, massive stone towers that still dot the landscape today. Over 7,000 of these structures were built, some standing 60 feet tall, constructed from enormous basalt blocks, fitted together without mortar. No one knows exactly what they were for. Watchtowers, temples, fortresses, probably all three. What we do know is that the Nuragic people were not isolated in terms of culture. They traded extensively with the Mycenaean Greeks, with Cyprus, with Crete. Archaeologists have found Mycenaean pottery in Nuragic sites and Sardinian bronzes in Greek palaces. They were connected to the wider Mediterranean world. They had access to advanced bronze working technology. They were cosmopolitan. But here's the twist. Despite all this contact, despite trade and cultural exchange, the Nuragic people remained genetically isolated. In 2019, researchers sequenced DNA from Nuragic-era skeletons excavated from burial sites across the island. The results were shocking. There was virtually no genetic admixture. These people traded goods with the Greeks, but they didn't marry them. They sold copper to the Phoenicians, but they didn't have children with them. The genetic continuity from the first farmers to the Nuragic civilization was unbroken. And the marker that proves this is haplogroup I2A1, the paternal lineage carried by around 40% of Sardinian men today. I2A1 is an ancient European hunter-gatherer lineage, one of the original Y chromosome groups that existed in Europe before the farmers even arrived. In most of Western Europe, I2A1 was wiped out during the Bronze Age, replaced by R1b from the steppe invaders. But in Sardinia, it survived and thrived. It's the dominant lineage, a genetic ghost from the Mesolithic era still walking around in the 21st century. But if Sardinia was so isolated, how do we explain the long list of empires that conquered it? The Phoenicians established trading posts on the coast around 900 BC. The Carthaginians turned it into a colony in the 6th century BC. The Romans conquered it in 238 BC and ruled for 700 years. After Rome fell, the Vandals took over, then the Byzantines, then the Arabs raided it repeatedly, then the Pisans and Genoese fought over it, then the Spanish ruled it for 400 years. Every major Mediterranean power left its mark on Sardinian history. So why didn't they leave their DNA? The answer lies in geography within geography. Sardinia isn't flat. The interior is dominated by mountains, deep valleys, and impenetrable terrain. The invaders controlled the coasts. They built ports, fortresses, and cities along the shoreline. But the interior, the region called Barbagia, remained unconquered. Barbagia means land of the barbarians, the name the Romans gave it because they could never fully control it. The people of Barbagia retreated into the mountains, living in villages accessible only by narrow mountain paths. They became shepherds, bandits, and resistors. They spoke their own dialects, they followed their own laws, and they refused to intermarry with the coastal invaders. This pattern repeated for over 2,000 years. Every empire that came to Sardinia could take the ports, but they couldn't take the mountains. And because the mountains are where most Sardinians lived, the genetic impact of these invasions was minimal. Coastal Sardinians do show traces of foreign ancestry. In the northwest, near the old Phoenician colonies, there's a detectable North African signal, around 5% to 8%. In the northeast, closer to Corsica, there's a small Italian and French influence, but in Barbagia, in the heart of the island, the DNA remains almost purely Neolithic. The bandits of the mountains preserved the ancient genome against the empires of the coast. But isolation comes with a cost. When a population stops mixing with outsiders, genetic diversity declines. Rare mutations become common. Harmful recessive traits that would normally be diluted by intermarriage start to concentrate. This is called the founder effect, and Sardinia is a textbook example. One of the most striking consequences is the island's relationship with malaria. For thousands of years, malaria was endemic in Sardinia, particularly in the lowland coastal areas. It killed thousands every year, but over time the population evolved a defense. Two genetic mutations became extremely common in Sardinia: beta thalassemia and G6PD deficiency. Both cause mild to moderate anemia, but both also provide partial protection against malaria. If you carry one copy of these mutations, you're more likely to survive a malaria infection. If you carry two copies, the anemia becomes severe, sometimes fatal. It's a genetic trade-off, and it only makes sense in a population that's been isolated long enough for natural selection to act. Beta thalassemia affects red blood cell production, making the cells smaller and less hospitable to the malaria parasite. In Sardinia, the carrier rate for beta thalassemia is around 12%, one of the highest rates in the world. G6PD deficiency affects an enzyme that protects red blood cells from oxidative damage. Normally this would be harmful, but in the presence of malaria, it disrupts the parasite's ability to reproduce. In Sardinia, G6PD deficiency affects around 15% of the population. These aren't random mutations. They're evolutionary adaptations that prove how long Sardinians have been on this island, isolated enough and stable enough for evolution to genetically engineer the population to survive the specific environment they lived in. Malaria was finally eradicated from Sardinia in the 1950s through a massive DDT campaign, but the genetic scars remain, a permanent record written into the DNA of millions. But isolation didn't just create vulnerabilities, it also created something remarkable: longevity. Sardinia is home to the world's first identified blue zone, a region where people live significantly longer than the global average. In the mountain villages of Barbagia, centenarians are common. Men live as long as women, which is almost unheard of anywhere else in the world. Globally, for every 10 female centenarians, there are only about 2 males. In Sardinia, the ratio is nearly 1-to-1. Why? Researchers have spent decades trying to answer this question. Part of it is lifestyle. The traditional Sardinian diet is rich in whole grains, vegetables, pecorino cheese, made from grass-fed sheep, and red wine from local vineyards. The Sardinians walk steep mountain paths daily, maintaining physical fitness into old age. They live in tight-knit communities with low stress and strong social bonds. But lifestyle alone doesn't explain the male longevity. That's where genetics comes in. One genetic marker in particular has drawn attention: M26, a Y chromosome subclade of haplogroup I2A1 found almost exclusively in Sardinia. Some studies have suggested that men who carry M26 live longer on average, though the mechanism isn't fully understood. What is clear is that Sardinia's genetic isolation removed certain harmful variants common in other populations. The lack of admixture meant that disease-causing alleles introduced by other groups never arrived. Meanwhile, the founder effect amplified beneficial variants. The result is a population genetically optimized for survival in their specific environment. They're not superhumans, they're adapted humans. Their DNA is a product of 7,000 years of isolation, natural selection, and cultural practices that reinforced genetic stability. They are living proof that evolution doesn't stop. It just moves slowly, and it needs isolation to work. But we need to be careful not to oversimplify. Sardinia isn't genetically uniform. The 2020 study revealed significant regional variation across the island. The north, particularly the area around Sassari, shows more genetic affinity with Corsica and Liguria in northern Italy. This makes sense. Sassari was historically connected to Genoa and Pisa, and there was more movement of people across the narrow strait separating Sardinia from Corsica. The south and west, particularly the regions around Cagliari and Oristano, show slightly higher levels of North African and Eastern Mediterranean ancestry, reflecting Phoenician and Carthaginian influence. And then there are the true outliers. The town of Alghero on the northwest coast speaks Catalan, not Italian or Sardinian. They're the descendants of Catalan settlers brought by the crown of Aragon in the 14th century. Genetically, they cluster more with Spanish populations than with other Sardinians. They're an island within an island, a genetic and linguistic enclave that proves even Sardinia's isolation wasn't absolute, but these are exceptions. The overwhelming majority of Sardinians, particularly those in the interior, carry the ancient signature. And that signature isn't just interesting for Sardinians, it's important for all of us, because Sardinia is a genetic museum. It's a place where the past is still alive, where the DNA of Neolithic Europe survived into the modern world. If you want to know what a European looked like 7,000 years ago, before the steppe invasions, before Rome, before any of the mixing that defines the rest of the continent, don't look at a German or a Brit or a Frenchman. Look at a Sardinian. They are the mirror. They are what Europe was before it became what it is. And that mirror reveals something profound about human history. We think of isolation as a weakness, a disadvantage. And in many ways it is. Isolated populations are vulnerable to disease, to genetic disorders, to the loss of diversity. But isolation also preserves. It protects. It allows populations to maintain their identity, their culture, their DNA against the homogenizing forces of empire and migration. The Sardinians didn't just survive, they thrived. They built one of the ancient world's most impressive civilizations without losing themselves. They resisted Rome, the Arabs, the Spanish, not through military might, but through geography and stubbornness. They turned their mountains into fortresses and their isolation into strength. Today, Sardinia is changing. Tourism has exploded. Mainlanders are moving to the island for work. Young Sardinians are leaving for opportunities in Milan, Rome, and beyond. The genetic isolation that defined the island for 7,000 years is finally breaking down. Within a few generations, the unique signature may begin to fade, diluted by admixture with the rest of Italy and Europe. But for now, it remains. The mystery of Sardinian DNA isn't just a curiosity, it's a lesson. It teaches us that human populations are not static. They evolve, adapt, and preserve in response to their environment. It teaches us that isolation, while often seen as a negative, can be a powerful force for cultural and genetic preservation. And it teaches us that the past isn't as distant as we think. It's still here, encoded in the cells of millions of people, waiting to be read by anyone willing to look closely enough. Sardinia is a fortress, a refuge, a museum, and a reminder that even in a globalized world, some things remain unchanged, held safe by mountains, by sea, and by the stubborn refusal of a people to forget who they are. If you found this journey into Europe's most isolated population fascinating, share this video with anyone curious about the hidden genetics of the Mediterranean. Are you from an island with a unique history? Have you taken a DNA test and discovered haplogroups that don't match your neighbors? Leave your story in the comments. You might be carrying a piece of history that vanished everywhere else, preserved by geography, culture, and time. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.